You were a mistake. The words had calcified in Madison's chest, hardening with each passing hour since Luca Thompson, Duke of Devonshire, had delivered them. 4 days had passed since their wedding night, yet the phrase followed her through the estate like a debt in his perpetual ledger. A regrettable mistake of family obligation, that's what she was, an error to be noted and filed away. Madison stood in the Devonshire library, her silhouette captured in the reflection of the rain-streaked windows that overlooked the perfectly manicured grounds. The heavy velvet of her deep burgundy gown, selected by Lucas Stewart according to Regulation 17 regarding ducal attire, whispered against the Persian rug with each breath. The antique lace at her collar had belonged to 3 generations of Devonshire duchesses. The garnets at her wrist were mentioned specifically in the family registry, item 4.7.2. Everything about her had been catalogued, authenticated, and approved. Everything except the rebellion crystallizing behind her dark, intelligent eyes. "Will Her Grace require tea in the drawing-room?" Madison had dismissed the housekeeper with the gracious smile she'd perfected during her philosophy lectures, the one that suggested thoughtful consideration while revealing nothing. The door had closed with a click. The silence that remained was suffocating, broken only by the metronomic ticking of the gilded clock on the mantelpiece. She studied the woman in the glass. Madison Hall, no, Madison Thompson now, daughter of a respected family of modest means, educated in literature and philosophy, fluent in Latin and French, with a mind sharp enough to debate Kant, and a heart foolish enough to believe a marriage could be a meeting of equals. She'd been prepared for partnership, for intellectual discourse beside a roaring fire, for a union where her thoughts would matter as much as her lineage. What she hadn't been prepared for was a husband who looked at her the way one might assess a miscalculation in an otherwise perfect equation. The Devonshire estate operated like clockwork, and Madison was learning that clockwork had no room for spontaneity. She discovered the first regulation on her 3rd morning as Duchess, when she'd asked for breakfast in the sunroom instead of the formal dining hall. The request had sent the housekeeper, Mrs. Geraldine, into what could only be described as polite panic. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but the Duke's standing order specifies that breakfast is to be served in the east dining-room between the hours of 7 and 8 o'clock. The sunroom is reserved for afternoon correspondence only, as outlined in the Household Procedures, Section 3, subsection B." Madison had stared at the woman, waiting for the smile that would indicate this was some elaborate jest. It never came. By the 5th day she'd begun to see the pattern. The estate didn't breathe, it functioned. Every servant moved through the halls with the precision of chess pieces, each action predetermined by some invisible rule-book that governed their existence. The maids entered rooms at prescribed times. The footmen stood at measured distances. Even the gardener pruned the roses according to a schedule posted in the servants' quarters, dated and signed by Luca himself. That afternoon, Madison wandered the corridors with the aimlessness of a woman searching for something she couldn't name. The portrait gallery stretched before her, a parade of stern-faced Thompsons whose expressions suggested they'd all died disappointed. She paused before a painting of Luca's grandfather, the 5th Duke, whose jaw bore the same rigid set as her husband's. "His Grace the 5th Duke established the current household regulations in 1789, came a voice behind her. Madison turned to find Mr. Crawley, Luca's elderly steward, his hands clasped behind his back in that perpetual posture of servitude. He believed that order was the highest form of respect. "And what of joy, Your Grace? Was there a regulation for that?" Mr. Crawley's expression didn't change. "Joy, Your Grace, is found in the proper execution of one's duties." She watched him retreat down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the marble with mechanical precision, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't a home. It was a museum where the living were required to perform as carefully as the dead. That evening, she made the mistake of entering Luca's study unannounced. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by ledgers stacked with the solemnity of religious texts. The room smelled of leather and ink and something else, the peculiar scent of a life reduced to entries and figures. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation at the disruption of his schedule. "The dinner bell hasn't rung," he said, as if this explained everything. "I wanted to speak with you." Madison moved into the room, her gown rustling in the silence. "About the household." "Mrs. Geraldine manages the household affairs. Any concerns should be directed to her during her designated hours." His attention had already returned to the ledger before him, his pen scratching across the page with bureaucratic efficiency. "I don't want to speak to Mrs. Geraldine. I want to speak to my husband." The pen paused. Luca set it down with deliberate care, aligned perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. When he looked at her, his grey eyes held all the warmth of a winter dawn. "I am in the middle of reconciling the estate accounts. Is this matter urgent?" "Is our marriage urgent?" she wanted to ask. "Is the fact that we are strangers living in the same tomb urgent?" Instead, she said, "I'd like to make some changes to the daily routines, perhaps allow the staff more flexibility in—" "The routines are established for a reason, Madison." He spoke her name like an item on a list. "They ensure efficiency and maintain the standard expected of Devonshire. My grandfather spent years perfecting these systems." "Your grandfather has been dead for 30 years." The words hung between them, sharp and irreverent. Luca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The regulations outlive us all. That's rather the point." Madison turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Tell me, Luca, in all these ledgers, all these careful entries and regulations, is there a line for us, for what we might have been?" He didn't answer. The scratch of his pen resumed, filling the silence with the sound of a life being reduced to numbers. She closed the door softly behind her and stood in the darkened corridor, listening to the clock in the entrance hall chime the hour. Somewhere in this vast, regulated prison, she would have to find a way to become more than an entry in the Duke's ledger of life, or she would have to burn the ledger entirely. The bookshop on Pembroke Street smelled of old paper and possibility, two things conspicuously absent from Devonshire. Madison had escaped the estate under the pretense of acquiring new sheet music, though Mrs. Geraldine had reminded her that such errands were typically handled by the household staff according to Regulation 43. She'd smiled graciously and ordered the carriage anyway, relishing the small rebellion even as the driver had looked uncertain about deviating from the Duke's prescribed schedule. London unfurled before her like a secret, all noise and commerce and delicious chaos. Here, at least, no one moved according to ledgers and timetables. Here, life was permitted to be messy. The shop itself was narrow and overstuffed, shelves climbing toward a smoke-stained ceiling like the Tower of Babel built from literature. Madison ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles in Latin, French, Greek, languages that reminded her of a self she'd nearly forgotten in the suffocating silence of Devonshire. She pulled down a volume of Seneca's letters, the leather worn soft with age and handling. "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality," a voice quoted behind her, smooth and amused, "though I suspect in your case the suffering is quite real." Madison turned to find a woman watching her with the calculating gaze of someone who made a habit of seeing what others wished to hide. She was perhaps 40, dressed in deep plum silk that spoke of wealth worn with easy confidence rather than dutiful display. Her dark hair was swept up in a style that was fashionable without being slavish to it, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd learned to weaponize observation. "I'm sorry," said Madison, though some instinct told her this woman was never sorry for anything. "Lady Eleanor Jones," she extended a gloved hand, "and you're the new Duchess of Devonshire, unless I'm very much mistaken, which I rarely am." Madison accepted the handshake, feeling suddenly exposed. "Have we been introduced?" "Not formally, but I make it my business to know things." Lady Eleanor gestured to the book in Madison's hands. "Seneca, how appropriately stoic. Tell me, are you seeking wisdom on enduring hardship, or are you simply trying to convince yourself that your suffering has philosophical merit?" The accuracy of it stung. Madison replaced the book carefully. "I came for sheet music." "No, you didn't." Lady Eleanor moved closer, her voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. "You came because that mausoleum your husband keeps is driving you mad, because you're starting to realize that Luca Thompson doesn't want a wife, he wants a properly catalogued addition to his collection of obligations." Madison's breath caught. "You seem to know a great deal about my marriage." "I know a great deal about men like your husband. I was married to one once." Lady Eleanor selected a book from a nearby shelf, Machiavelli's The Prince, and held it out like an offering. "He believed that control was love, that order was devotion. It took me 3 years to understand that I'd been sleeping beside a man who thought emotions were weaknesses to be regulated out of existence." "And what did you do?" The question escaped before Madison could stop it, hungry and desperate. Lady Eleanor's smile was sharp as cut glass. "I became powerful enough that his regulations no longer applied to me. Tell me, Your Grace, do you know what your husband fears most?" "I'm not certain my husband fears anything." "Everyone fears something. Luca Thompson fears chaos, disorder, the uncontrollable." She pressed the book into Madison's hands. "Men like him build their worlds from rules because they're terrified of what might happen if those rules crumble. They mistake rigidity for strength."
Madison stared at the book, Machiavelli's name embossed in fading gold. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I see something in you that you haven't seen in yourself yet." Lady Eleanor tilted her head, studying Madison with the intensity of an art appraiser evaluating a masterpiece. "You're not a mistake, despite what he said. You're a wildfire that's been told to burn according to regulation. And I find myself wondering what would happen if someone taught you to spread." The words sent something electric through Madison's chest, part fear, part exhilaration. "I don't understand what you're suggesting." "Don't you?" Lady Eleanor moved toward the door, then paused. "I host a salon every Thursday evening. Intellectuals, artists, the sort of people who believe conversation is more valuable than convention. You should attend. Bring your philosophical leanings and your sharp tongue. Leave the Duchess costume at home." "My husband?" "Your husband will object, naturally. He objects to anything not outlined in his precious regulations." Lady Eleanor's smile turned knowing. "Which is precisely why you should come. Consider it an experiment in applied philosophy, testing whether your reality must match his suffering." She left in a whisper of plum silk, and Madison stood alone among the books, Machiavelli heavy in her hands. Through the shop window, she could see her carriage waiting, the driver checking his pocket watch with the anxious precision of someone who knew the Duke expected punctuality. The Duke expected many things. Perhaps it was time to disappoint him. Lady Eleanor's salon occupied a townhouse in Mayfair that seemed to exhale sophistication. Unlike Devonshire, where every surface gleamed with the sterile perfection of a museum, Eleanor's drawing room was alive, cluttered with books, half-finished correspondence, and the lingering smoke of expensive cigars that suggested rules were made to be elegantly ignored. Madison had arrived without informing Luca, a small act of defiance that felt enormous.
Mrs. Geraldine had pursed her lips when Madison ordered the carriage for an evening engagement not listed in the household schedule, but she'd gone nonetheless, her heart hammering against her corset stays. The salon itself was in full flow when she entered. 24 guests scattered across velvet sofas and chairs, their conversation a symphony of wit and wine. A poet was reading something scandalous in the corner. A pair of musicians debated the merits of Mozart versus Handel with the passion of holy war. And there, holding court near the fireplace, was a woman who made everyone else look like they were merely practicing at living. "Lady Freya Bond," whispered Eleanor in Madison's ear, appearing at her elbow like a conspirator. "Watch her. She's a masterclass in power." Freya was perhaps 50, with silver-threaded auburn hair and the kind of beauty that came from absolute certainty in one's own worth. She wore emerald silk that cost more than most people earned in a year, and she wore it like armor. When she laughed, the room seemed to lean toward her, hungry for inclusion in whatever private amusement she'd discovered. "She's a widow," Eleanor continued, "left with a fortune and no patience for society's expectations. She can make or break a reputation with a single dinner invitation. If Freya Bond declares you fascinating, you become fascinating. If she finds you tedious, you might as well retire to the country." "And why would she care about me?" Eleanor's smile was sharp. "Because I'm going to make her care." Before Madison could protest, Eleanor was steering her across the room with the confidence of a general positioning troops. "Freya, darling, I've brought you something interesting." Freya turned, and Madison found herself under the scrutiny of eyes that missed nothing. They catalogued her Worth gown, her nervous posture, the way her hands twisted together, every detail absorbed and assessed in seconds. "The Duchess of Devonshire," Freya said, and something like amusement flickered across her face. "I'd heard Luca Thompson finally married. Tell me, how does one survive being wed to a ledger?" The room had gone quiet, conversation dying like candle flames in a draught. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how the new Duchess would handle Freya Bond's particular brand of examination. Madison could feel the old instinct rising, to smile graciously, to deflect, to perform the dutiful wife. But something Eleanor had said in the bookshop echoed through her mind. "You're a wildfire that's been told to burn according to regulation." "One doesn't survive it," Madison said, her voice steadier than she felt. "One either suffocates under the weight of regulations, or one learns to rewrite them." Silence. Then Freya laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine. "Oh, I like her. Eleanor, you brilliant creature, where did you find her?" "Hiding in a bookshop, reading Seneca like a woman planning an escape." "Or a revolution." Freya gestured to the seat beside her. "Sit, child. Let me look at you properly." Madison sat, feeling the weight of the room's attention like a physical thing. Freya studied her with the intensity of a jeweler examining a stone for flaws and potential. "Here's what I see," Freya said finally. "A woman of considerable intellect trapped in a marriage to a man who mistakes control for connection. A duchess who's being treated like a footnote in someone else's story." She leaned forward. "The question is, do you want to remain a footnote, or would you prefer to become the story itself?" Madison faltered, uncertain what answer was expected. "Don't think, feel." Freya's voice was sharp. "What do you want?" The truth rose in Madison's throat like a confession. "I want to matter. I want my husband to look at me and see something other than a mistake to be managed." "Then we'll make you unmissable." Freya glanced at Eleanor. "She'll need a complete transformation, not her appearance, that's acceptable enough, but her presence, her position in society. We need to make her indispensable." Eleanor nodded. "I was thinking Thursday salons to start. Let people see her mind." "Not enough. Half of London society thinks intelligence in women is charming until it becomes threatening." Freya circled Madison like an architect surveying a building site. "We need to establish her as essential, not just clever, powerful, the woman every hostess wants at their table, the duchess whose favor matters." "And when Luca objects?" Madison asked. Freya's smile was razor-sharp. "Let him. A man who keeps his wife in a glass case can hardly complain when she shatters it from the inside." She extended her hand. "Welcome to your rebranding, Your Grace. When we're finished, Luca Thompson won't recognize the mistake he made, because you'll be the only part of Devonshire worth remembering." Madison took her hand and felt the architecture of her new life beginning to take shape. The first salon at Devonshire was an act of calculated rebellion. Madison had spent 3 weeks under Freya's tutelage, learning the delicate art of wielding influence like a blade. She'd memorized names, studied allegiances, and discovered that power in London society was less about bloodlines and more about knowing which conversations mattered. Freya had been merciless in her instruction. Charm is cheap. Indispensability is priceless. Now, standing in Devonshire's long-neglected music room, Madison surveyed her handiwork. She'd ordered the furniture rearranged without consulting the household regulations. The rigid rows of gilt chairs, positioned according to some arcane formula from 1789, had been replaced with intimate clusters that encouraged conversation. Candles flickered in deliberate disarray rather than mathematical precision. The room looked lived in, warm, dangerously inviting. Mrs. Geraldine had nearly wept when she'd seen it. "Your Grace, the Duke's grandfather specified the exact placement of every piece in this room. It's all documented in the estate records, section 12, subsection—" "Mrs. Geraldine," Madison had interrupted gently, "I appreciate the history, but tonight we're making new history." The guests arrived at 8, a carefully curated collection of writers, philosophers, musicians, and the sort of minor aristocrats who valued ideas over pedigree. Lady Eleanor came with a playwright whose latest work had scandalized the theatres. Freya swept in with a political theorist who'd just published a controversial pamphlet on parliamentary reform, a violinist, a portrait artist, a woman who'd translated Dante into English. They filled the music room with exactly the kind of chaotic brilliance that Devonshire had never witnessed. Luca appeared in the doorway at 8:30, still in his riding clothes, his expression suggesting he'd discovered vandals in his sanctuary. "Madison," her name came out clipped, precise. "What is this?" She crossed to him, champagne glass in hand, aware that every guest had fallen silent. This was the moment Freya had prepared her for, the public test of will. "A salon, darling. I thought it was time Devonshire contributed to London's intellectual life." This was not discussed. His jaw was tight enough to crack walnuts. "The music room has designated purposes. Thursday evenings are reserved for estate correspondence." "How fortuitous that I've freed your evening, then." She smiled with the sweetness Freya had taught her, the kind that concealed knives. "You're welcome to join us. We're debating whether Burke's concept of the sublime has any practical application in modern governance." Something dangerous flickered in Luca's eyes. He glanced around the room, taking in the rearranged furniture, the animated guests, the absolute absence of regulation. When he looked back at Madison, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "We will discuss this later." "I look forward to it." She turned back to her guests, dismissing him with the casual confidence of a woman who'd learned that power was simply the willingness to claim space. "Now, where were we? Mr. Hartley, you were making a fascinating point about the relationship between aesthetic experience and political philosophy." The conversation resumed, louder now, emboldened by the Duchess, who just faced down a duke. Luca remained in the doorway for another moment, a figure of rigid disapproval, before vanishing into the dark corridors beyond. The salon lasted until midnight. By the time the last guest departed, Madison's face ached from smiling, but something fierce and bright burned in her chest. She'd done it. She'd claimed this space, these hours, this version of herself. She found Luca in his study, predictably, surrounded by his ledgers like a priest at prayer. "You humiliated me," he said without looking up. "I hosted a salon." "You violated every established protocol for this household." He set down his pen with violent precision. "The music room has not been used for entertaining since 1802. The regulations clearly state—" "The regulations are dead, Luca." Madison moved into the room, and for the first time since their wedding night, she didn't flinch from his cold gaze. "This is Devonshire." His voice was ice. "There are standards, traditions that have been maintained for what? Your comfort? Your grandfather's ghost?" She leaned against his desk, invading his carefully ordered space. "I am the Duchess of Devonshire now. That means something whether you wish it or not. Those people tonight, they'll remember this evening. They'll talk about it in every drawing room in London, and when they do, they'll say that Devonshire has finally awakened from its long sleep." Luca stood abruptly, and for a moment she thought he might actually shout. Instead, his voice came out quiet, lethal. "You were supposed to be an asset to this house, not a disruption." "Perhaps," Madison said, "you should have married a ledger instead of a woman." She left him there, surrounded by his regulations and his rage, and climbed the stairs to her chambers with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won the first battle of a very long war.
Lady Amelia Bradley arrived at Devonshire like a summer storm, beautiful, expected by some, and carrying the potential for destruction. Madison first learned of her existence from the servants' whispers, those half-court conversations that died the moment she entered a room. It was Mrs. Geraldine who finally provided clarity, her tone carefully neutral as she mentioned that Lady Bradley has called to pay her respects to His Grace, as is customary given their long acquaintance. Long acquaintance. The phrase hung in the air like expensive perfume, cloying and deliberate. Madison found them in the drawing-room, positioned by the window, where the afternoon light turned everything golden and forgiving. Amelia was exquisite in the way that certain paintings were exquisite, flawless composition, calculated beauty, the kind of woman who'd been raised to be looked at and admired. Blonde curls arranged with artful precision, a gown of palest blue that suggested innocence while revealing just enough throat and collarbone to contradict it. And Luca, her husband, was smiling. It wasn't the cold, dutiful expression Madison had grown accustomed to. This was something else, warmth, perhaps even pleasure. The kind of smile that suggested the person before him had earned the right to see something beyond his regulated exterior. "Ah, Madison." Luca stood with an ease that made her stomach clench. "Allow me to introduce Lady Amelia Bradley. Amelia, my wife, the Duchess of Devonshire." "Your Grace." Amelia's curtsy was perfection itself, neither too deep nor too shallow. When she rose, her blue eyes held Madison's with the confident assessment of someone who'd already won. "How lovely to finally meet you. Luca has told me so much about his new Duchess." The possessive use of his Christian name was deliberate. Madison recognized the strategy. Freya had warned her about women who weaponized intimacy. "Lady Bradley, I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage. My husband hasn't mentioned you at all." Something sharp flickered across Amelia's features before the sweetness returned. "Oh, how like Luca to be modest about our friendship. We've known each other since childhood. Our families' estates border one another in Hertfordshire. Why, I practically grew up in these very halls." "How fortunate for you." Madison moved into the room, claiming space the way Freya had taught her. "Though I notice you've been absent since my arrival. One might think you were avoiding the new Duchess."
"Not avoiding," said Amelia, her laugh like wind chimes. "Merely being tactful. I thought it best to give you time to settle into your new role without the confusion of too many familiar faces around Luca." Around Luca, not around Devonshire. The distinction was precise as a scalpel. "How considerate!" Madison turned to her husband. "Darling, I wasn't aware you were receiving callers this afternoon. I've scheduled the music room for a poetry reading at 4. Several members of the Romantic Society will be—" "I've asked Amelia to stay for dinner," Luca interrupted, and there was something almost defiant in his tone. "It's been too long since we've had proper conversation." Proper conversation, as if the salons Madison had been hosting were somehow improper, illegitimate. She felt the cut of it, sharp and intentional. "Of course," she said, her smile never wavering. "I'll inform Mrs. Geraldine to set an additional place, though I should warn you, Lady Bradley, that dinner conversation at Devonshire has become rather intellectual of late. Last week we debated Kant's categorical imperative for 2 hours. I do hope philosophy doesn't bore you." Amelia's answering smile could have frozen champagne. "I prefer more traditional topics, I confess. The running of great houses, the preservation of family legacy, the kind of practical matters that actually sustain an estate like Devonshire." She turned to Luca with conspiratorial warmth. "Do you remember when your grandfather used to say that a well-ordered household was worth more than any amount of clever talk?" "I do." Luca's expression softened in a way Madison had never witnessed. He believed that tradition was the foundation of everything worthwhile. Such wisdom! Amelia moved closer to him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. It must be difficult maintaining those standards when the modern world seems so determined to discard them. All this fashionable intellectualism, these salons and debates, they're quite amusing, I'm sure, but hardly what Devonshire was built upon. The attack was elegant, wrapped in nostalgia and concern. Madison recognized it for what it was, an opening gambit designed to align Amelia with Luca's values while positioning Madison as the outsider, the disruption, the threat to everything sacred. "You're quite right," Madison said, her voice carrying across the room. "Devonshire wasn't built on intellectual discourse. It was built on land seizures, strategic marriages, and the systematic accumulation of power through whatever means proved effective." She met Luca's gaze directly. "I'm simply continuing the family tradition, just with better conversation." She left them there, united in their shared past, and retreated to the library, where her books waited like loyal soldiers. Through the window she could see the manicured grounds of Devonshire stretching toward the horizon, beautiful, controlled, suffocating. Lady Amelia Bradley had returned to reclaim territory she believed was rightfully hers. It was time to teach her that Devonshire had a new mistress, and this one didn't surrender ground easily. The emerald necklace vanished on a Tuesday, though Madison wouldn't learn about it until Wednesday morning when Luca appeared at her chamber door with an expression that promised nothing good. "We need to speak," he said, and the formality in his voice made her stomach tighten. "In my study, now." She followed him through the corridors, aware of servants averting their eyes as they passed. Whatever was coming, the household already knew about it. That couldn't be good. Luca's study had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom. Mr. Crawley stood by the desk, holding what appeared to be an inventory ledger. Lady Amelia occupied a chair near the window, her face arranged in an expression of tragic concern. And there, spread across the mahogany desk like evidence at a trial, was a velvet case, empty. "The emerald necklaces," Luca said without preamble. "They've been in my family for 6 generations. My grandmother wore them at her presentation to Queen Charlotte. They're listed in the estate inventory as heirloom item 173A. He paused, and when he looked at her, his eyes held something close to accusation. "They're missing." I don't understand. What does this have to do with me? The necklace was last documented in the Duchess's jewelry collection, Mr. Crawley said, his voice professionally neutral. According to Household Regulation 68, the Duchess is responsible for the security and maintenance of all jewelry assigned to her use. I've never even seen these emeralds. Madison looked between the three of them, feeling the trap closing. Mrs. Geraldine showed me the jewels I was permitted to wear, but— The emeralds were in your possession, Luca interrupted. They were transferred to your keeping 3 weeks ago, as is customary for the Duchess of Devonshire. The transfer is documented. He gestured to the ledger in Mr. Crawley's hands. Your signature is on the inventory receipt. I sign dozens of documents every week. Half of them I barely read because they're for mundane household. She stopped, understanding flooding through her like ice water. This is absurd. You're accusing me of stealing from my own household. Not stealing, Lady Amelia's voice was soft, regretful, perfectly modulated. No one is suggesting anything so crude, Your Grace, but perhaps misplaced. You've been so busy with your salons and your intellectual pursuits. It would be understandable if you'd been careless with matters of estate property. The implication was clear. Madison's mind was on frivolous things, not the sacred responsibility of preserving Devonshire's legacy. I haven't been careless, Madison said, her voice sharp. I haven't touched those emeralds because I didn't know they existed. The documentation suggests otherwise. Luca picked up a piece of paper, his expression carved from granite. According to Household Regulation 74, established by my grandfather, any loss of heirloom property due to negligence or misconduct results in immediate restriction of the responsible party's household privileges until restitution can be made. Restitution, the word tasted bitter. How does one make restitution for something they didn't take? The regulation is quite clear. Mr. Crawley's tone held no malice, just the terrible neutrality of a man who'd spent his life serving protocol over people. The Duchess's social activities must cease until the matter is resolved. No salons, no public engagements, no unauthorized use of estate rooms or resources. Understanding crashed over her. This wasn't about emeralds. This was about power, about putting her back in the glass case where Luca believed she belonged. And Amelia had orchestrated it beautifully, using Luca's own obsession with regulations as the weapon. "You can't be serious," Madison said, but she could see in Luca's face that he was. "You're going to imprison me in my own home over a necklace I've never seen." "Not imprisonment, restriction." His voice was ice. "Until the emeralds are recovered or accounted for, I have no choice but to follow the established protocols. My grandfather's regulations exist precisely for situations like this." "Situations like this?" She laughed, harsh and disbelieving. "Your grandfather couldn't have anticipated his descendant would be manipulated by—" She caught herself, barely before saying what she wanted to say. Amelia rose gracefully, moving to Luca's side with the ease of long familiarity. "Perhaps, Your Grace, this is an opportunity for reflection. You've been pushing so hard against Devonshire's traditions. Maybe the universe is suggesting you slow down, remember what's truly important." The concern in her voice was exquisite, poisonous. Madison wanted to tear it apart, to scream that this was theatre, that Amelia had staged every moment. But she could see in Luca's face that he'd already made his choice. The regulations were sacred. His wife was suspect. "How long?" Madison asked quietly. "Until the matter is resolved." Luca wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'll have inquiries made. If the emeralds were stolen by staff, the guilty party will be found. If they were simply misplaced, then we'll locate them. But until then, the regulations stand." "Of course they do." Madison moved toward the door, then paused. "Tell me, Luca, do your precious regulations have anything to do with how a husband should trust his wife, or is that too human a consideration for your grandfather's ledger?" She didn't wait for an answer. She swept from the room with the last shreds of her dignity intact, leaving behind the empty jewelry case and the two people who'd conspired to fill it with her downfall. In the corridor, she found Lady Eleanor waiting, her face grave. "I heard," Eleanor said simply. "She's won," Madison whispered. "She's used his own rules to cage me." Eleanor's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Then perhaps it's time to stop playing by his rules entirely." 3 days of silence had turned Devonshire into a tomb. Madison had been confined to her chambers and the library, her salons cancelled, her guests turned away at the door with apologetic explanations about household matters. The staff moved through the halls with funeral quietness, and even Mrs. Geraldine had stopped meeting her eyes, as if looking at the disgraced Duchess might somehow implicate her in whatever crime the regulations claimed had been committed. But silence, Madison had learned, was excellent for thinking. She found Luca in the estate's long gallery on the 3rd evening, standing before the portrait of his grandfather, the 5th Duke, architect of the regulations that had become his descendants' gospel. The old man's painted eyes stared down with the certainty of someone who'd believed order could solve every human complexity. "I wondered when you'd come," Luca said without turning. "Did you?" Madison moved into the gallery, her footsteps echoing against marble. "Or were you hoping I'd stay locked away until I'd learned to be properly penitent?" "I was hoping you'd use the time to reflect." He finally turned to face her, and in the candlelight his features looked carved from stone. "On the seriousness of what's happened, on your responsibilities to this house." "My responsibilities?" She laughed, sharp and bitter. "Tell me, Luca, what exactly are my responsibilities? To smile graciously while being accused of theft? To accept imprisonment in my own home because your precious regulations demand it? To pretend that my life matters less than your grandfather's paranoid need for control? Those regulations have preserved Devonshire for generations. Those regulations are killing you." The words came out fierce, unplanned. "They're killing us both. Can't you see that?" His jaw tightened. "Lower your voice." "Why? Afraid the servants will hear? Afraid someone might witness the Duke of Devonshire being confronted with something that can't be filed away in a ledger?" She moved closer, and he actually took a step back. "You hide behind these rules, Luca. You use them like armor against anything real, anything human, anything that might require you to actually feel something. This has nothing to do with feeling. This is about order, structure, the preservation of what? A legacy? A name?" Madison gestured at the portraits lining the walls. "These dead men and their dead rules have more influence over your life than any living person. You serve ghosts, Luca. You worship at the altar of your grandfather's fear. My grandfather built Devonshire into one of the greatest estates in England. Your grandfather was terrified." The words rang out like a bell. "He was terrified that if he didn't control every detail, every moment, everything would fall apart. So he wrote his fear into regulations and called it wisdom. And you," her voice broke slightly, "you've inherited his terror and mistaken it for duty." Luca's face had gone white. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" She pulled a book from the shelf beside her, one of his grandfather's journals, which she'd found in the library during her confinement. "Listen to this. Order is the only defense against chaos. A man who cannot control his household cannot control his fate. Emotion is weakness. Affection is vulnerability. The regulations must stand above all else, or everything crumbles." She looked up. "This is what you've built your life on, the ravings of a man so afraid of losing control that he forgot to live. That's enough."
"It's not nearly enough." Her voice rose, years of suppressed frustration finally breaking free.
You called me a mistake on our wedding night. Do you remember that? You looked at me, your wife, a woman you'd chosen to marry, and you called me a regrettable mistake of family obligation, not because I'd done anything wrong, and because I'd disrupted your orderly little world. I was trying to establish boundaries. You were trying to make me disappear. The words echoed through the gallery. To reduce me to another entry in your ledgers, another regulation to be managed. But I'm not a ledger entry, Luca. I'm a person, a woman with thoughts and desires, and the audacity to believe that marriage should be more than a contractual arrangement administered according to some dead man's rules. You want me to abandon everything Devonshire stands for. I want you to remember that Devonshire is supposed to be a home, not a museum. She was close to him now, close enough to see the conflict warring in his grey eyes. I want you to understand that a life lived entirely by rules is not a life at all. It's existence, it's survival, it's the slow suffocation of everything that makes us human. And what would you have me do? His voice was raw now, the careful control finally cracking. Throw away generations of tradition, ignore the structures that have kept this estate functioning? I would have you think. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath the expensive fabric. I would have you choose, for once in your life, what you actually want, rather than what Regulation 37 tells you to want. I would have you look at me and see your wife instead of a deviation from your perfectly ordered world. Madison, the emeralds are in Lady Amelia's possession. The words came out flat, certain. She took them from my jewellery case during her visit, probably with a copy of the key provided by someone on your staff who values her friendship over mine. She's using your regulations as a weapon to destroy me, because she knows you'll choose protocol over people every single time. Luca's face had gone very still. You're accusing Amelia. I'm telling you the truth. Madison stepped back, suddenly exhausted. But you'll have to decide whether truth matters more than regulations, whether I matter more than your grandfather's ghost, whether your marriage is worth more than maintaining order in your precious ledger. She turned to leave, then paused at the gallery door. A life without rules would be chaos, Luca said quietly. Perhaps. But a life lived only by rules is already death. At least chaos is alive. She left him there, surrounded by portraits of men who'd chosen order over love, duty over humanity, regulations over life. And she waited to see what choice her husband would make. The Pemberton Gala was the event of the season, and Madison had no intention of missing it. She'd received the invitation weeks ago, before the scandal of the emeralds, before her confinement, before everything had crystallized into this final confrontation. Luca had assumed she wouldn't attend, had even sent word to Mrs. Geraldine that the Duchess would be remaining at Devonshire due to delicate household matters. But Madison had learned something crucial during her days of silence. She was done asking permission. She arrived at the Pemberton townhouse alone, stepping from her carriage in a gown of deep crimson silk that Lady Freya had sent with a note reading simply, "Burn it all down." The color was deliberate, shocking, a declaration of war in fabric form. Duchesses wore pastels. Duchesses wore white or pale blue or modest lavender. Duchesses did not wear the color of revolution. The ballroom fell silent as she entered, a ripple of shock moving through the assembled guests like wind across water. She could see Luca across the room, standing with a cluster of peers, his expression shifting from surprise to something darker as their eyes met. And there, at his elbow like a pale ghost, was Lady Amelia Bradley, her face draining of color. Lady Freya materialized at Madison's side, resplendent in gold. "Are you certain about this?" "Completely." Madison accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant. "Is everything in place?" "Eleanor has been circulating the story all evening. Half of London already suspects. You just need to provide the proof." Madison moved through the crowd with the confidence of a woman who'd stopped fearing consequences.
Conversations died as she passed, then resumed in furious whispers. She could feel the weight of judgment, curiosity, scandal, the entire aristocracy holding its breath to see what the disgraced Duchess of Devonshire would do next. She found Lord Pemberton near the refreshment table, exactly where Freya had said he'd be. "Your Grace," he said, bowing with the careful neutrality of a man who wasn't certain which side of the scandal to support, "we're honored you could join us." "Lord Pemberton, I wonder if you might indulge me," Madison's voice carried, deliberately loud. "I understand your daughter recently commissioned a piece from Mr. Davidson on Bond Street." "Yes, she did. A lovely sapphire bracelet. And Mr. Davidson mentioned something interesting to her, I believe, about a recent unusual commission he'd received." Pemberton's expression shifted to confusion, then understanding. "Ah, yes, my daughter did mention it. Someone had brought in antique emeralds to be reset, quite extraordinary stones, apparently, Georgian era, museum quality. He'd been told they were a family piece being updated, but the woman who brought them had given a false name," Madison finished, "and Mr. Davidson, being the conscientious tradesman he is, kept detailed records of the transaction, including a description of the woman." The ballroom had gone silent now. Every eye was turned towards them, watching the scene unfold like theater. "Your Grace, I'm not certain I understand," Pemberton began. "The Thompson emeralds were stolen from Devonshire 3 weeks ago. I was accused of negligence, confined to my chambers, banned from society, all because of household regulations that demand accountability for missing heirlooms." She turned, finding Luca in the crowd. He'd moved closer, his face unreadable. And there, at his elbow, like a pale ghost, was Lady Amelia Bradley, her face draining of color.
The gasp that went through the room was audible. Amelia stood frozen, her perfect composure finally cracking. "This is absurd!" "Is it?" Lady Eleanor stepped forward, and Madison realized her friend had been waiting for this moment. "Because I took the liberty of speaking with Mr. Davidson myself this afternoon. Such a helpful man. He even showed me his ledger entry, the one with a detailed physical description and the false name used, Mrs. Thompson. How curious that someone would use the Duchess's married name while impersonating her at a jeweler's shop." "You have no proof." Amelia's voice was shrill now, the sweetness completely stripped away. "I have Mr. Davidson's testimony," Eleanor continued smoothly. "I have the shop ledger, and I have 3 witnesses who saw you examining the Duchess's jewelry case during your visit to Devonshire, including a housemaid who noticed you asking very specific questions about which pieces the Duchess actually wore." All eyes turned to Luca, the Duke of Devonshire, standing at the center of his collapsing world, forced to choose between the regulations that had governed his entire existence and the truth being laid bare before him. "Luca, you can't possibly believe." Amelia reached for his arm. He stepped back from her touch, and something in that single movement told Madison everything she needed to know. "The regulations state," Luca said quietly, his voice carrying in the silence, "that theft of estate property is grounds for immediate banishment from Devonshire and all associated holdings." He looked at Amelia, and his expression was emptied of everything except cold finality. "They also state that false accusation intended to harm the reputation of the Duke's household carries the same penalty." "You would believe her over me," Amelia's voice broke, "after everything we've been to each other." "You used my own laws to attack my wife." Luca's words fell like hammer blows. "You exploited my adherence to protocol, knowing I would follow the regulations without question. You were right about that. It was shamefully easy to manipulate." He turned then, crossing the ballroom floor with measured steps until he stood before Madison. The entire aristocracy watched as the Duke of Devonshire, a man famous for his rigid adherence to protocol, did something unprecedented. He knelt. "I was wrong,"
he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. About everything. About you, about the regulations, about what matters. I called you a mistake, but the only mistake was mine. I'm asking, he paused, and she saw the cost of what this admission demanded. I'm asking if you can forgive me. Madison looked down at her husband, this man who'd built his life from rules and regulations, now breaking his most sacred protocol by showing vulnerability in public. She thought of the cold wedding night, the months of isolation, the emeralds used as weapons. Then she thought of the man who'd stood in the gallery, his careful control finally cracking, the man who was choosing, perhaps for the first time in his life, what he wanted over what regulation demanded. She extended her hand. "Stand up, Luca. Dukes don't kneel." He rose, taking her hand, and in front of all of London society, he smiled, not the cold, dutiful expression she'd grown accustomed to, but something real and uncertain and alive. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "it's time they learned."
The Book of Regulations had lived in Luca's study for as long as anyone could remember, bound in leather the color of dried blood and filled with his grandfather's cramped, obsessive handwriting. It sat on a pedestal like a religious text, consulted daily, quoted like scripture, treated with the reverence most men reserved for holy relics. Madison found Luca standing before it 3 days after the gala, his hand resting on the cover as if saying goodbye to an old friend. "I've been reading it," he said without turning, "really reading it, not just following it blindly. Do you know what I found?" She moved to his side, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What?" "Fear." His voice was quiet. "Every page, every regulation, every careful instruction, it's all fear. Fear of chaos, of loss, of vulnerability. My grandfather was terrified that if he didn't control everything, he would lose everything. So he wrote his terror into law and called it legacy." "And you inherited his fear?" "I did." He turned to face her, and in the morning light streaming through the study windows, he looked younger somehow, unburdened. "I thought that following his rules meant honoring him, but all I've been doing is perpetuating his suffering and forcing you to suffer with me." Madison touched his face gently. "You didn't force me. I chose to stay. Even when you made it unbearable, even when leaving would have been easier, I chose to fight for this, for us." "Why?" The question was raw, genuine. "I called you a mistake. I treated you like an error in my ledger. Why didn't you just leave?" "Because I saw something in you that you couldn't see in yourself." She smiled, sad and knowing. Beneath all those regulations, all that rigid control, there was a man desperate to feel something real. You just didn't know how to reach for it without your grandfather's rule book telling you the proper procedure. Luca laughed, harsh and honest. "There is no regulation for falling in love with your wife. Believe me, I checked." The words hung between them, fragile and precious. Madison felt something in her chest crack open, not breaking, but blooming. "Say it again," she whispered. "I love you." He said it, like a man confessing a crime, like admitting something dangerous and uncontrollable. "I think I started loving you the moment you told me that a life lived by rules is a life not lived at all. But I was too afraid to acknowledge it, because love wasn't in the regulations. Love doesn't follow protocol. It's messy and chaotic and completely ungovernable." "It is," she agreed. "Terrifying, isn't it?" "Absolutely." He picked up the Book of Regulations, weighing it in his hands. "Which is why this needs to end." He carried it to the fireplace, where the morning fire still burned low. Madison watched as he opened the book to a random page, Regulation 47, regarding the proper procedure for dismissing servants. His grandfather's handwriting crawled across the yellowed paper like insects. "Are you certain?" he asked. "No." He looked at her, and his smile was uncertain, alive. "But I'm learning that certainty is overrated. You've taught me that." He dropped the book into the flames. The leather caught slowly at first, reluctant to burn, as if even in destruction it clung to its authority. Then the fire found the pages, and they went up like kindling. All those regulations, all those careful procedures, all that codified fear turning to ash and smoke. They stood together watching it burn, Luca's hand finding hers and holding tight. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we write our own rules." Madison leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body beside hers. "Or better yet, we don't write any rules at all. We just live." "I don't know how to do that." "Neither do I," she laughed. "We'll figure it out together. Make mistakes, probably, hundreds of them, but at least they'll be our mistakes, not ones prescribed by dead men who were too afraid to make their own."
Mrs. Geraldine appeared at the study door, then stopped short at the sight of smoke rising from the fireplace. "Your Grace, is everything—" She paused, recognizing what was burning. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Everything is fine, Mrs. Geraldine," Luca said, and his voice held a lightness Madison had never heard before. "Actually, everything is changing. Starting today, the household will operate on a new principle: common sense and human kindness. Do you think you can manage that?" Mrs. Geraldine's eyes glistened. "I think, Your Grace, that it would be a profound relief." Over the following weeks, Devonshire transformed. The rigid schedules dissolved. Servants smiled in the corridors. The music room hosted salons 3 times a week, filled with laughter and debate and the kind of chaotic brilliance that made the old walls seem to breathe for the first time in decades. Luca attended them all, initially awkward, but gradually learning how to engage in conversation that didn't reference regulations or protocol. Lady Freya declared the transformation absolutely scandalous and utterly delightful. Lady Eleanor simply smiled knowingly, as if she'd predicted this outcome from the beginning. One evening, 6 months after the gala, Madison found Luca in the portrait gallery, standing before his grandfather's painting. But this time he wasn't alone. He'd commissioned a new portrait, one of Madison in her crimson gown, her dark eyes alight with intelligence and defiance, looking like exactly what she was, a woman who'd refused to be a footnote in someone else's story. "I've ordered it hung here," Luca gestured, to the space beside his grandfather's portrait, "so everyone who comes after us will see them side by side. The Duke who built Devonshire on fear, and the Duchess who saved it with courage." "That's not quite accurate," Madison said softly. "We saved it together." "No," he turned to her, pulling her close. "You saved me. I'm just trying to be worthy of that salvation." She kissed him then, there in the gallery, surrounded by centuries of Thompsons who'd never learned that love was stronger than legacy, that vulnerability was braver than control, and the greatest mistake a man could make was calling his wife one. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of Devonshire, they would mark it as the moment the estate entered its golden age. They would write about the intellectual salons that attracted the greatest minds of the era, about the Duke who'd abandoned his grandfather's rigid protocols in favor of something far more radical: humanity. But the most fascinating detail, the one that captured the public imagination, was always the same story. The Duke had called his bride a mistake on their wedding night, and she made certain that history never forgot it, transforming that single cruel word into the foundation of a love story that would outlast all the regulations ever written. The mistake, it turned out, was the only thing worth remembering fondly, and Devonshire, at long last, had learned how to live. Thank you for staying with Luca and Madison through their journey from hurt to healing, from obligation to love. Some marriages begin with romance, but theirs began with wounds that had to be tended before anything beautiful could grow. If their story touched you, if you recognize the courage it takes to trust again after being called a mistake, or the strength required to demand being seen as more than an entry in someone's ledger, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like,
comment, and subscribe for more stories about love that fights for itself, even when the fight is hard. You're the reason these stories exist.